Evet. Başlayabiliriz isterseniz. Bugün 66.sını düzenlediğimiz İzmir Dilbilim Çevresi etkinliklerine hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün Birmingham Üniversitesi'nden Doğuş Can Öksüz hocamızla beraberiz. Ben kısaca bir kendisini tanıtayım. Aslında ben onu çok uzun yıllardır tanıyorum. Çocukluğundan tanıyorum. Yani Amasya'dan aile dostluğumuz var. Ama Doğuş Can'ın o zamanlar böyle bir dil bilimci olacağını ya da akademisyen olacağını hiç tahmin etmiyordu kimse. Doğuş Can hocamız lisans eğitimini 2013 yılında Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Yabancı Dil Eğitim bölümünde tamamlamış. Ondan sonra Edinburgh Üniversitesi'nde Dr. Kenneth Fordis danışmanlığında Developmental Patterns of Modality Used by Turkish EFL Learners and Accessibility of Explicit Knowledge, a Learner Corpus Analysis başlıklı bir yüksek lisans tezini bitirmişti 2014 yılında. 2015 yılında kabul edildiği Lancaster Üniversitesi Dil Bilimi İngiliz Dili doktora programında Profesör Patrick Rebusha ve Dr. Václav Brezina danışmanlığında yazdığı Collocational Processing in Typologically Different Languages, English and Turkish, Evidence from Corpora and Psycholinguistic Experimentation başlıklı tezini 2019 yılında tamamlamıştır. Doktor Doğuş Can Öksüz hocamız Lancaster Üniversitesi'nde bütünce dil bilim projelerinde mentörlük yapmış. Yine aynı üniversitede öğretim görevliliği yapmıştır. Cambridge Üniversitesi'nde dil, beyin ve toplum dersini vermiş. Leeds ve Cambridge Üniversitelerinde bütünce dil bilim alanında yani Corpus Linguistics alanında araştırma görevliliği yapmıştır. Halen Birmingham Üniversitesi'nde araştırmacı olarak çalışmakta ve dil bilim ve dil bilimciler ve psikodil bilimciler için araştırma yöntemi ve akademik becerilere ilişkin etkinlikler düzenlemektedir. Bugün kendisi bizlere eş dizimsel işlem, Türkçe çevirisiyle vereyim isterseniz. Eş dizimsel işlemleme, sözcük sıklığı, öbek sıklığı etkileri ve dil bilimsel tipoloji, yani Collocational Processing, the Effects of Word Frequency, Phrasal Frequency and Linguistic Typology başlıklı sunumunu yapacaktır. Umarım hepimiz için yararlı, faydalı olur diyorum. Sözü Doğuş Hocam'a bırakıyorum.
Özgün Hocam çok teşekkür ederim beni davet ettiğiniz için. Burada olmak çok güzel. Bu sizin grubunuzun YouTube'daki konuşmalarının bir kısmını dün izleme şansım oldu. Çok da keyif aldım. Hatta keşke daha önceden baksaydım, izleseydim dedim. Şimdi ekranımı paylaşayım. Konuşma İngilizce yapacağım. Bunun için çok özür diliyorum. Ama tabii ki anlaşılmayan her neresi varsa Türkçe açıklarız. Hatta sorularınızı istediğiniz dilde sorabilirsiniz. Zaten nasıl rahat ederseniz İngilizce ya da Türkçe. So, okay, let's get started. So I'll be talking about my research focusing on the processing of multi-word units. And as Özgün Hocam just said, my interest in the topic has started during my PhD at Lancaster, and it even increased ever since. It is expanding to more typologically different languages now, including Chinese and Estonian and also Portuguese. Here is the outline of next 30-35 minutes. I'll first try to convince you that multi-word units such as collocations or idioms are such significant parts of our linguistic inventories rather than rare constructions that is been previously described by generativist perspectives. Maybe I'll even be preaching to the converted. And then I will be drawing on empirical evidence from developmental processing and then corpus analysis. And then I'll be presenting two pieces of empirical research that I conducted in the last 3 years. So usage-based models of language processing is built on a number of assumptions. One key assumption is that languages are dynamic systems and they are intimately bound up with users' lifetime experience of the language. In other words, language processing is sensitive to the frequency of usage. But how does this work? Well, it means each and every processing opportunity affects the language user system. In that regard, we can view language processing as a statistical accumulation of experience. And also there's a direct and immediate relationship between learning a language and processing a language. Essentially, when we learn a language, we learn how to process it. In a way, we learn to expect the next word, the upcoming word. So this brings us to some cognitive constructs that are crucial in language processing, such as memory. Here, when we talk about memory effects, essentially we talk about frequency effects. That can be frequency of individual words or frequency of the whole phrases. So according to usage-based approaches, all linguistic material, whether it consists of single words or larger sequences, processed by the same cognitive mechanisms. Multi-word units has occupied a prominent role in the study of language learning and processing for several decades. So there's a mounting developmental processing and corpus evidence that multi-word units alongside individual words should be seen as integral building blocks of language. For example, we have growing developmental evidence showing that 1-year-olds can distinguish between frequent and infrequent phrases, even way before they begin producing them. And 4-year-olds are able to, for example, produce irregular plurals when they are part of a frequent phrase versus when it's part of an infrequent phrase. For example, they are more accurate to produce a phrase like brush your teeth versus brush your feet. Turning to the processing studies, both first and second language speakers show sensitivity to the frequency of phrases. And we can find this evidence in reaction time research, eye tracking, and even neurological evidence such as EEG or ERP. And also, alongside frequency, the meaningfulness of the phrases are also important. More meaningful phrases are processed faster than less meaningful phrases. Obviously, the frequency of these phrases are controlled. And also, finally, this is in a little bit in a way building a bridge between developmental and processing research that showing that similar to the age of acquisition effects observed for children, adult speakers also process phrases that they learn earlier in their childhood. And finally, corpus research is showing that multi-word units constitute a huge part of a big proportion of both spoken and written discourses. Between 40 and 50% of native speaker discourses consist of multi-word sequences. So these findings demonstrate that language users hold mental representations of multi-word units alongside individual words. So let's try to define collocations a little bit. I would just provide a simple, very simple formula here, which is word plus word would equal to a collocation. But it's actually quite a heterogeneous term to use. For example, it can just mean combination of any lexical items, basically young man, or kızıl saç in Turkish. Basically, the next slot is open. It can be, for example, young man can be replaced by young woman, or kızıl saç can be a düz saç. Or collocations can be highly exclusive phrases. For example, some phrases with technical meanings, such as ozone layer or sağanak yağmur. Basically, when we hear or see the first word, the next word almost comes to our mind within seconds. Or even milliseconds. And also collocations mean something semantically non-compositional. Basically, there is not a semantic relationship, easy semantic or straightforward semantic relationship between the first word and the second word. As we can see here, for example, like a draw a conclusion or çene çalmak type of things. Obviously, these are also, quite idiomatic phrases. So, I'll be presenting two pieces of research where I try to disentangle what is the relationship between the first word and the second word in basically people's processing. So this is the first empirical study that I'll present today. It's published in Language Learning in 2021. It's open access, so you can just scan the QR code if you want to have a look at the full report. So an important gap in knowledge concerned the processing of the prominence of individual word and phrasal frequencies for processing collocations. The previous research showed that the phrasal frequency, the frequency of the whole phrase, whole collocation, seem to affect both L1 and L2 speakers processing. So we extended the previous research by examining the effects of individual word frequencies in addition to the phrasal word frequencies. So we just looked at whether L1 speakers or L2 speakers, L1 and L2 speakers are differentially impacted by the frequencies of the individual words and the frequency of the whole collocation. And we also manipulated the frequency of the collocations, such as we looked at like very frequent phrases like young people, and also we looked at less frequent collocations like lovely house. So we looked at whether people's reliance on individual word frequencies and phrasal frequencies would be different depending on the frequency of the phrase. In addition to the frequency, we also looked at the association. So that's another gap in the literature, and the impact of association between words making up the multi-word units is less understudied. So corpus linguistics provides us with dozens of association measures, and these measures are designed to combine information about frequency with other statistical properties like exclusivity or dispersion, like how widely distributed these phrases are in the files of a corpus. We explore two association measures. The first one is mutual information, which is a very, very popular measure. It has been very popular in the field and even recognized as a field standard measure, and it expresses the ratio between the collocation frequency and the frequency of the random co-occurrence of the two words. So in a way, what MI score does is that it treats corpus like being a box, and in which all words are written on small pieces of paper, and the MI score just basically thoroughly shakes the box for us. And then, basically two words are, picked in it, and it's in a way, it's based on this random co-occurrence model. Obviously, this is not how we use language. We don't choose our words based on random selection. We choose our words based on number of cognitive and contextual constraints. So instead of MI, we wanted to explore an alternative measure, which is log dice, which used the harmonic mean of two proportions that express the tendency of two words to co-occur relative to the frequency of these words in the corpus. Basically, it was log dice considers the individual frequencies of these words for calculating its association scores. So removing this random co-occurrence element, it highlights exclusivity, but not necessarily rare combinations. So we thought if we compare the MI and log dice scores and whether which one predicts people's processing better would give us some good results. So our participants were a group of L1 English native speakers and a group of quite advanced level L2 speakers of English. In this table, you could see some basic information provided about our participants. Like you can see some demographic information like age, gender. To measure people's proficiency, we used Lextail. It's a test of advanced vocabulary knowledge. Be used as a proxy for general English proficiency. And we found that L1 English group had significantly larger vocabulary size than the L2 group did. And this is also absolutely fine and expected. So our experimental materials fell into one of these critical conditions: high frequency collocations, low frequency collocations, and the baseline items. And also using the BNC XML corpus, we extracted single word frequency counts of adjectives and nouns. And also we calculated the collocation frequency counts. And then we also calculated mutual information and log-dice scores to compare their prediction of L1 and L2 speakers processing. So this is our simple experimental procedure. Participants first saw an eye fixation, and then we showed them the two-word collocation, and we asked them to press either yes or no buttons. And then we measured their reaction time and accuracy. So let's look at participants' response times. Here on the x-axis, we see item type, baseline, high frequency or low frequency, and here on the x-axis, we see on the y-axis, we see people's response time. So the brief results show no significant difference between L1 and L2 speakers. That was interesting to see that L2 speakers seem to be sensitive to the collocations as much as the L1 speakers. For each type of item, we see exactly the same trends between the two groups. So here we can see that pink is the L1 English group and the blue is L2 English group. Basically, their L1 is Turkish. So there's a collocation effect in both languages. Response times were faster for high frequency collocations compared to low frequency collocations, and they responded faster to the low frequency collocations than the baseline items, and this is all absolutely expected. So what we can see here is that both groups were sensitive to the frequency at which collocations occur, and as the frequency of the phrases go up, their response times also became faster. So they were processing more frequent items faster. Just repeating this bit because it's important, we didn't find any difference between L1 and L2 groups, either in terms of overall mean response times or any of the specific item types, like, for example, L1 speakers weren't responding to high frequency items significantly faster than the L2 group. We also looked at whether L1 and L2 speakers differ in their reliance on adjective frequency, noun frequency, and the phrasal collocation frequency. And we didn't find any difference. So both L1 and L2 speakers were similarly impacted by adjective frequencies, noun frequencies, and collocation frequencies. But what the difference where we found was that we found the difference between both groups' sensitivity to noun frequency when they are processing the high frequency versus low frequency items. So when they were processing low frequency items, their reliance on noun frequencies increased. I tried to visualize this effect here for you. So the green line shows us people's responses for high frequency items, and the red line shows their responses to baseline items. As we see here, as the noun frequency increase, their responses for low frequency collocations became gradually faster, but we don't see the same impact, at least not in the same level, for high frequency items. So the impact is much, much stronger for low frequency collocations than the high frequency collocations. In other words, what's happening here is that as the collocation frequencies increase, both L1 and L2 speakers tend to respond to them, tend to process them more holistically. When the frequency decreases, they need to rely on the individual words more. So we also compared the mutual information and log-dice scores. What we found here is that log-dice scores produced a better fitting model, but we didn't really find any difference between L1 and L2 speakers' reliance on mutual information versus log-dice scores. The log-dice scores producing a better fitting model seems like a positive result, but we need to interpret it cautiously because this has just happened because log-dice scores are more homogeneous than the MI scores. Since MI scores are based on a little bit of a, this random co-occurrence model, they tend to provide overinflated scores for low frequency items. So this is just what we're finding is the impact of the measure rather than people's sensitivity to measure. So I'm not really proud of this result. So just an interim conclusion, language users are sensitive to the statistics of multi-word units in the form of frequency, including individual word frequency and phrasal frequency. And also they seem to be sensitive to the association of the two words, but we couldn't disentangle what drives this impact that drives their sensitivity to association. We need to do more research on that. And also importantly, processing collocations involves combining information about individual words and phrases. And the key feature of these combinations predicting the upcoming words. People learn to predict the upcoming words, and that's why we are as language users sensitive to the word-to-word statistical information. So we don't really, no matter how frequent they are, at least in this research, people weren't processing these items holistically. They are sensitive to the individual word frequencies and the phrasal frequencies. So if there is any question about this specific study, I can take the questions now, or I can just move to the next study. No question? So we also looked at, this is a study currently under review. We're doing the second round of revisions. So some of the results may change in the next few months. So I can't promise that, if I do this talk in another place, I'll be able to talk about them in exactly the same way. But about the 95% of it, I'm absolutely sure that the results are solid. So here we looked at native speakers of the two languages processing of collocations in their respective L1s. So I mentioned that there is compelling evidence in the literature that language speakers represent phrases alongside individual words in their language processing and production systems. However, there is not much evidence whether such representation can be generalized to typologically different languages. Because so far, very surprisingly, the vast majority of the evidence is coming from European languages, or basically 85% of it is coming from English. So we want to know whether languages with more complex morphology and flexible word order would also show similar effects. This is because if a language has more complex morphology and flexible word order, it inevitably has fewer recurring multi-word units than other languages. This is because having different morphological markings requires that the same utterance will necessarily have different forms. Obviously, this will impact frequency. This will have an impact on frequency, because we'll have a different form for basically each case marking, or depending on the number or person agreement, or in some languages, a gender agreement. So English and Turkish are quite typologically distinct in this regard. English is morphologically isolating. Basically, it has a very poor morphology, and it has a very fixed order. Turkish, on the other hand, is a morphologically complex language and has a free word order. So we wanted to look at how people are differently or similarly sensitive to similar constructions in these two languages. So we looked at adjective noun collocations again. The reason is that adjective noun collocations kind of follow the similar word order, although the adjective noun relationship is slightly different in Turkish. Adjectives also can follow nouns. And also, more importantly, we can see some impact of inflection. Like, for example, nouns inevitably will get case markings. So we first did a corpus study. Oops, sorry. Yeah. we first did a corpus study to determine the extent to which frequency counts are different for Turkish and English two-word adjective noun collocations. And this provided some insight into speakers' cumulative experience with these constructions. And also, we specifically looked at two types of frequency here, which is a form frequency, basically the frequency of the verbatim phrase occurring in the corpus, and also morphological family frequency, which basically includes all the inflections of that noun. Like, for example, kapı, we just all summed up all case inflections together. And then we did an online acceptability judgment task to evaluate English and Turkish speakers' processing of adjective noun collocations in their respective languages. So we had two predictions, and a key hypothesis is that speakers are sensitive to the statistical properties of multi-word units at multiple grain sizes. We were expecting that both English and Turkish speakers were sensitive to the individual word frequencies as well as phrasal frequencies. Basically, this is consistent with our previous study. And also, we predicted that since the statistical frequency of individual words and phrases are different in the two languages, speakers' processing mechanisms adapt to the rich diversity of statistical properties of their respective languages. So we were expecting that probably Turkish speakers could be a bit more sensitive to the individual word frequencies than English speakers, and English speakers would be a bit more sensitive to the phrasal frequencies than the Turkish speakers, because obviously English speakers are more trained on operating with phrases than us. So this is the corpus results. Here we looked at the general corpus of the two languages, the TNC and the BNC, the British National Corpus and the Turkish National Corpus. We extracted like 5,000-6,000 adjective noun collocations in each languages, and we modeled frequency counts, and we didn't find a main effect of language. Basically, both languages have similar frequencies of adjectives and nouns, but what we found as a difference is that some morphological forms of the Turkish collocations were actually very, very rare. So we didn't really find, for example, nouns inflected with all 5 case markings similarly. In fact, they differ quite a lot. So, briefly, results showed no significant differences between the two languages in terms of overall response times. And for each type of item, we see exactly the same trend in both languages. Here, green is English and pink is Turkish. And it is possible to say that there is collocation effect in both languages. So since response times were faster for high frequency collocations compared to low frequency collocations, and they responded to the low frequency collocations faster than the baseline items. This is all expected, and this is all fine. And I can easily say that speakers of both languages seem to be sensitive to the phrasal frequencies. So when it comes to the difference between the two languages, there was a significant interaction between language and collocation effects, which shows that as the collocation frequencies increased, both language speakers responded faster. But the effect of collocation frequencies on English speakers' response times was stronger. So this is exactly as we expected. English speakers are represented with the red line. And as we can see that collocation frequencies make a stronger impact on their processing than the Turkish speakers. In addition to the phrasal frequencies, the frequency of nouns also impacted the processing in both languages. And so which kind of shows that actually when we process adjective noun phrases, nouns play a much more important role than the adjectives. And that kind of makes sense because the adjectives just are there, they are there to modify the noun, and nouns are the meaning makers. So this is consistent with the predictions of usage-based accounts, providing further support for the role of multi-word units as building blocks in both languages. Also, this means that frequently occurring adjacent elements are chunked to facilitate processing in typologically different languages. But this doesn't mean that we process collocations holistically. We are still sensitive to individual word frequencies or the meaning of the individual words. Importantly, the adjective noun collocations used in this study are largely compositional. For example, I showed you one example like, young man or front door, which means that both adjectives and nouns contribute to the meaning of the phrase. But I don't mean that the adjectives and nouns, make the equal contribution. Probably nouns are have a more significant role to play in that. And also we found that language typology at least partly impacts speakers' sensitivity to frequency information. Possibly Turkish speakers are much less sensitive to the phrasal frequencies because the language's agglutinating morphology results in many more individual word forms than the English ones because we have many more inflections. What we find here is that there's a difference in general processing biases, and typology impacts processing word combinations. So here I'd like to contextualize or even speculate about why these findings can be important for language processing beyond collocations, beyond multi-word units. So chunking individual words into multi-word units reduces the computational burden imposed by sentence embeddings or long-distance, syntactic dependencies. But in agglutinating languages, there is yet another burden, which is the ridiculous number of suffixes. So we can, obviously this is a joke, and we don't say that often Avrupalılaştıramadıklarımızdan mısınız, but also this kind of phrase is absolutely, fine, and, it's grammatical. So maybe to process such long combination of suffixes, we also create a chunking impact, or we chunk the suffixes together. So once we step outside English or English-like languages, we have a bit different perspective on processing. For an agglutinating language like Turkish, we should expect that multi-word units are likely to have an effect on language processing. So I'm not suggesting that Turkish is less prone to chunking. Maybe it's even more prone to chunking, but some of the chunking is taking place for processing morphological combinations. So to fully understand the role of multi-word units in processing in agglutinating languages, we should be able to come up with a processing model that also help us to understand the processing of morphemic combinations alongside multi-word combinations. I'll stop here because obviously I just wanted to indicate that I'm also interested in morphological processing. So for the two papers I presented here, I was privileged to work with Patrick Monahan, Patrick Rebusha, and Václav Brezina, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Evet, Doğuş Can hocamıza teşekkür ediyoruz bu güzel sunumu için. Sorularınız olursa el kaldırarak, mikrofonunuzu açarak sorabilirsiniz arkadaşlar. Şeyden de yazabilirsiniz, chat kısmından da yazabilirsiniz.
Büşra güzel bir soru sormuş. Sorunu okuyabilir miyim Büşra, yoksa kendin mi okumak istersin?
Ben göremedim soruyu. Doğrudan mesajla mı sormuş?
Evet, sanıyorum. Okuyun diyor şimdi. Hocam, what were the criteria for choosing the low and high frequency collocations in the experiment? I mean, apart from the frequency, there were any other criteria? Yes, there was other criteria. For example, what we looked at, the semantic neighborhood density. What we looked at, we tried to include equal number of collocations with abstract and concrete meanings in the high and frequency, in the high and low frequency bands. And we also, obviously, you know, this is also very, very important to match the individual word frequencies of low frequency items and high frequency items, because we need to make sure that just the phrasal frequency makes a difference rather than individual word frequencies. And also we match the length of the items. Basically, items in high frequency band and low frequency band had equal number of words, equal number of letters, or you can also, you know, match them by syllable as well. That also makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Büşra herhalde yazar sana. Burcu hocamızın bir
Thanks
sorusu
hocam
var.
diyor. Tamam.
Tamam.
Mikrofonu açamıyormuş.
Tamam. Mikrofonda sıkıntı var. Tamam. Dilbilim bölümünden bizim bölümümüzün profesörü Burcu İlkay Karaman hocamız bir soru
Buyurun
soracak.
hocam.
Okay, thank you for this lovely presentation. I have a question to you. Have you considered comparing in the European languages?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, English with German.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe that this would give it a different dimension.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are major differences between English and Turkish, but then there is the thing of negative transfer with neighboring or with languages that are from the same family. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
if I was to give an example, for instance, you'd say auf der Liste, which translates as on the list into German, but you'd say in the list in English.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there is a negative transfer. For instance, me as a native speaker of German
Mm-hmm.
have this frequent problem of the negative transfer, because I find myself writing down I'm on the list, whereas it should be in English in the list, but you say it auf der Liste, on the list in German. So there is this impact which should not be ignored actually when combining two words that might, you know, result in errors caused by the native language of that person. I might give you one more example, for instance.
Please.
With if there isn't an equivalent in the language that, for instance, again, from German to English or vice versa, you'd say adjacent in English, which doesn't exist in German. So that's another problem. You might come around it with, you might not use adjacent, but you might use at or near or next to in German, but you don't have adjacent. So that's another problem. I think it would be a good idea to look at examples from in the European languages as well to see whether there would be any negative transfers based on, you know, what the language combination is of that particular person. Is this person an English native speaker or a German native speaker? And then these two groups could be possibly compared with each other.
That's a, thank you so much for this point. That's a very, very interesting and thoughtful point about this. And yes, I absolutely agree with your point that whether the similar word combination exists in people's L1 or, you know, basically if they're bilinguals or, you know, in one of the languages definitely impact their processing. So if this point concerning the first study, my first study, where what I did was basically controlling this effect, like all high and low frequency collocations were also meaningful phrases in people's L1. So basically what I tried to do is that, control this effect. But the lexical combinations in people's first language definitely impact their processing in the second language. Maybe not only, whether they exist or not, maybe the frequencies of these phrases also might have an impact on that. There are studies looking at this, and they use the terminology congruency or incongruency for that. If the same combination exists in people's L1, this is what they call congruent. And Brent Walter and Yamashita look at studies. They have done studies like this, looking at whether the phrase is meaningful or not in their L1, and to what extent this impact their processing. And I think that would be an absolutely very meaningful test case. And in the examples that you gave, particularly, for example, as far as I'm concerned, you chose the propositional phrases, right?
Yes.
I think in propositional phrases, definitely we would find an effect.
Yes. Knowing it from myself, that I feel speaking, well, I don't count the fourth one, but frequently speaking these three languages, and with two mother tongues, I feel that there is a negative transfer from German rather than from Turkish.
Because these two languages are closer.
Sorry to interrupt, but I had the same problem with the Norwegian as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a mishmash, we'd say in German. I think you could create, for instance, different groups for groups with one native language and two foreign languages, or groups with two native languages and one foreign language. So I think just comparing with two languages, okay, you will get interesting results, but maybe not interesting enough.
So these days, actually, we look at this for Portuguese by collaborating with our Portuguese colleagues like Amalia Mendes, and also my PhD supervisor also. He's also Portuguese-German bilingual, so we are collaborating with them at this point, and we look at this from a corpus linguistics perspective, because they have a very nice learner corpus. And we have data from, for example, L1, L2 Portuguese, L1 English, L1 German. So we exactly, is a great position to do that using corpus. I think that would also be great experimental as well. It's a great research avenue that we could pursue. Definitely. Thank you so much for that.
So finally, just one more point to add. My presumption is that this negative impact between German and English is because they are from the same family. Turkish is from a different family, right? Yeah. So you won't get that much negative impact. You would get it, amongst these European languages, like I have, Norwegian, English, and German. So you have two Germanic and one Romance, but there is still negative impact that you get when choosing the right preposition.
Yeah, definitely, because as you said, these are typologically very similar languages, so we would expect a higher influence, definitely.
Yes, definitely. Okay, thank you for the presentation once again.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate your question.
Evet, başka sorusu olan. Teşekkür ediyoruz Burcu Hocam. El kaldıran var mı ya da chatten? Ben şeyi soracaktım. İlk çalışmada ana dili Türkçe olan katılımcılarla çalıştın galiba. Bir öğrenci derlemi ya da öğrenci bütüncesi oluşturdun mu diye. Ya da
Hayır.
hazırda var mıydı böyle bir şey? Onu mu kullandın?
Hayır, burada data yani birinci çalışma zaten tamamen experimental. Orada kimden faydalanmıştık? Oldukça iyi advanced bir gruptan data almaya çalıştık. Boğaziçi Üniversitesi'nden yardımcı olmuşlardı. Onların 4. sınıf öğrencileri sağ olsun deneye katıldılar. O sadece o şeyde tarif ettiğim gibi bir reaction time deneyiydi.
Anladım.
Yani orada bir korpus
Korpus kullanmadın. Anladım.
evet, orada bir korpus kullanamadık. Ama zaten benim bildiğim kadarıyla hani Türkçe learner corpus ya da pardon yani L1 Turkish learner corpus elimizde yok.
Hmm.
Varsa çok mutlu olurum.
Benim bildiğim de yok. Hani böyle bir şey var mı, kullanıldı mı diye sordum. Hani şeyler var. Almanya'da 2 dilli korpuslar var. İngiltere'de de var galiba 2 dilli Türkçe İngilizce korpus ama öğrenci korpusu pek bulunmuyor. Bunu sormak istedim. Bir de şey bulgusu çok ilginç. Hani Türkçe'de yani chunking yapmayı bekliyorsunuz aslında. Bütün dillerde bekliyorsunuz. Özellikle işte çok sözcüklü dilsel bilimlerde chunking olması hani belleğin şey yapılması açısından, idareli kullanılması açısından çok önemli ama bunun olmadığını gördük. Yani iki sözcüğün kendi sıklık değerleri de etkili, sadece öbeğin sıklık değeri değil de öbeği oluşturan birimlerin sıklık değerleri, özellikle adların değeri önemli. Bu da aslında Türkçe'de işlemleme kapasitesinin biraz biçim bilimle şey arasında paylaşılmasını, söz dizimi arasında belki paylaştırılmasını gerektiriyor.
Kesinlikle öyle. Biz de öyle düşünüyoruz. Çünkü bu kadar biçim bilimsel olarak zengin bir dilin mutlaka yani kocaman bir morfolojisi olan 4-5 tane ekin bir araya geldiği bir ortamda bunların içinde hiçbir chunking operation olmaması büyük bir sürpriz olur. Bilişsel olarak, kognitif olarak da çok aklıma yatkın gelmiyor. Ama belki bu hani şunu söylemem lazım. Burada benim seçtiğim collocational, benim seçtiğim eş dizimli sözcüklerde iki kelimenin de sıklık etkisini bulduk. Belki çok daha sık kullanılan, çok hani mesela başbakan muhtemelen Türkçenin 500 yıl önceki, 400 yıl önceki halinde iki ayrı kelimeden oluşuyordu. Sonra
Evet.
bunlar bir arada kullanıla bir compound yarattılar. Muhtemelen başbakan derken artık baş kelimesinin herhangi bir sıklık değerinin bir anlamı kalmamıştır. Çünkü onlar artık yani
Evet.
chunking'in son aşamasına geldiler. Ama zaten hani bu benim bu bulgularımdan bir tanesi bunu da destekliyor açıkçası. Çünkü mesela eş dizilmiş sözcüğün öbeğin sıklığı arttıkça insanların kelimenin sıklığına olan hassasiyeti azalıyor.
Anladım. Yani öbek sıklığı arttıkça kelimelerin sıklığı değerini yitiriyor.
Evet, değerini
Belirleyici
yitiriyor.
etkisini yitiriyor. Değerini yitiriyor
Evet,
değil mi?
evet,
Belirleyici etkisini yitiriyor.
evet.
Gayet güzel bir bulgu aslında, yani önemli bir bulgu.
Hı-hı. Ama tabii yani belki göz takip veya hani daha nörobiyolojik bir bulgu başka bir şeyler gösterebilir burada yani. Bizimkisi biraz daha tabii basit yani. Bir reaction time.
Evet, yani tepki süresi ölçerek yapılıyor ama göz takip ya da EEG ya da
Hı-hı.
başka
Evet.
görüntüleme yöntemleriyle, kayıt yöntemleriyle belki bir şey
Hı-hı.
yapılıyor. Bugün biz burada
Gerçi
öğrenci...
onlar da genelde kelime sıklığı etkisi genelde onlar da buluyorlar. EEG yapanlar da buldular. Yani
Belki chunking hani şey açısından, hani gruplama açısından belki değişik etkiler bulunabilir. Özellikle biçim bilim açısından zengin Türkçe dillerde bakılabilir buna. Cihan Hocam var. Cihan Hocam bilişselle ilgilendiği için belki ondan bir yorum alabiliriz.
Benden mi bahsediyordunuz?
Top sizde hocam. Evet.
Kısaca özetleyebilir misiniz soruyu yine?
Yani hani Doğuş Can hocam şeyle bakmış. Tepki süresini ölçerek bakmış. Hani başka yöntemler kullanılabilir mi bu etkileri kanıtlamakta ya da hani gruplama etkisini daha iyi. Yani Türkçe gibi biçim bilimi çok zengin değillerdi. Çünkü gerçekten hani 4-5 orta 7 galiba ortalama 7 idi biçim birim sayısı bir sözcük üzerinde yapılan yani bilgisayarcılar bir çalışma yapmıştı burada 9 Eylül'de. Yani bir sözcük üzerinde ortalama 7 biçim birim görülüyor Türkçe'de. Bu gayet yüksek bir sayı. Hani böyle bir gruplamanın içine bir de çok sözcüklü gruplamayı dahil ettiğimizde hani nasıl bir çalışma yapılabilir? Sizin bildiğiniz var mı? Siz hani bilişsel
Ya bu şey biraz
bilişsel
böyle deneysel şeyler yap. Pek ben anlamıyorum
ha,
biliyorsun.
deneysel tarafında değilsiniz tamam. Özür
Evet yani.
dilerim.
Üzgünüm.
Yok yok hayır sorun değil. Hani şimdi o bilişsel bilimlerde olduğunuzu biliyorum ya oradan aklıma geldi hani şey olarak.
Hmm.
Tabii deneysel yönü olayın çok farklı. Yani sen Doğuş Hocam hem derlem çalışıyor hem de deneysel çalışıyor. Bu ikisini birleştirebilmek gerçekten büyük emek istiyor. Hani sen şey değil,
İkisini
kolay
de
değil.
doğru düzgün çalışmadığım için hiçbir şey diyemiyorum.
Evet.
Ben hep teorik boyutta ya da böyle biraz son zamanlarda semantik.
Hı.
Onun dışında yok yani.
Evet, başka sorusu olan var mı arkadaşlar? Aslında biz bugünkü yüksek lisans dersinde işlemiştik. Bilişsel yükün
Hı hı.
ne kadar önemli olduğunu yani bellek etkilerinin önemli olduğundan bahsetmiştik biraz. Bu hani çok sözcüklü birimlerin hani dilin temel taşı, temel yapı taşlarından biri olduğunu söylüyor zaten Doğuş Hocam da ve bunların işlenmesinde tabii kendi deyimiyle yani seçtiği eş dizinli sözcüklerin etkisi de olabilir. Daha farklı sözcükler seçilse belki şey olabilir. Siz hani sıklığa göre mi belirlediniz şeyi? Yani en sık görülen.
Evet, yani sıklık tabii en önemli hani bizim için ayıran noktalardan bir tanesi. Bir süre daha öyle olmaya devam edecek çünkü mesela yani bu sıklığın artması ve azalmasıyla ilgili insanların işlemlemesinin nasıl etkilendiği üzerine hala çok şey bilmiyoruz aslında. Daha onu öğrenme aşamasındayız. Ama mesela ben isim sıfat çalıştım. Hep isim sıfat seçtim. Belki mesela fiil, isim, verb, noun gibi bir şeyler birazcık daha farklı etki yaratabilir.
Evet orada belki üye yapısının da etkisiyle,
Evet,
argüman structure'ın
evet,
da etkisiyle belki daha farklı sonuçlar elde edilebilir.
evet.
Onlara da bakılması gerekebilir.
Mesela Burcu hocamın söylediği propositional şeylerde mesela orada eğer mesela benim perspektifimden eğer mesela propositional phrases gibi bir şeylere bakıyorsanız orada mesela birinci kelimenin yani oradaki proposition'ın sıklığının çok bir anlamı olmaz zaten. O zaten çok sık bir şey. Yani
Evet çok sık kullanılan bir şey. Evet.
o sizin işlemlemenizi etkilemez ama orada bakılması gereken şey muhtemelen o iki dil arasındaki kullanılan proposition'ın farkı.
Evet denk olması ya da denk olmaması.
Orada yani orada semantiğe bakarsınız, orada anlama bakarsınız ama iki kelime eğer ikisi de bildiğimiz zaman lexical yani content word içerik taşıyan kelime ise, anlam taşıyan kelime ise orada sıklığın bir anlamı olur. Çünkü
Evet.
zaten hani İngilizce gibi bir dilde zaten proposition dediğimiz şey zaten gramatik bir şey yani.
Evet. Çok sık kullanılıyor zaten. Evet.
Evet.
Evet başka soru yok herhalde.
İnsanları özgür bırakalım bence. Zaten bayram
Evet. Tamam, Doğuş Hocam çok teşekkür ediyoruz
Ben
gerçekten.
çok teşekkür ederim beni davet ettiğiniz için. Sizinle
Zevkli
bu
bir
vakti geçirmek
sunumdu.
çok güzeldi.
Ee, Büşra Kamaz teşekkür ediyor.
Ben teşekkür ediyorum.
Yani bu tür çalışmaların devamını bekliyoruz ve öğrencilerimize de bir ışık tutuyor aslında. Çünkü yani yapılabilecek neler olduğunu görüyorlar. Bu açıdan hani teşekkür ediyoruz. Görkem de teşekkür ediyor. Biz de Görkem'e teşekkür ediyoruz.
Ben de teşekkür
Bu
ediyorum.
saatte gelip bize sunumumuzu yaptığınız için katılımcılarımıza yani günün yorgunluğunun ardından gelip bir de sunum dinledikleri için teşekkür
Ben
ediyorum.
teşekkür ederim gelip dinlediğiniz için. Bir de tam Yani bayram tatili öncesi akademik bir sunum dinlemek çok da keyifli olmaz herhalde. Bir dahaki önümüzdeki dönemde Estonca ve Çince, yani şu anda o konuda devam eden deneylerimiz var. Onları da paylaşırım sizinle. Muhtemelen tabii ki 6-7 ay sonra, en az bir sene sonra falan olur yani.
Sabırsızlıkla bekliyoruz Doğuş Hocam. Yüz yüze görüşmek üzere. Görüşmek dileğiyle konferanslarda ya da başka yerlerde. Umarım bu online eğitimden kurtulduktan sonra yüz yüze görüşme fırsatımız olur buralarda.
Evet,
Görüşürüz.
insanlara herhalde Türkiye'de bir pandemi yetmedi, ikinci pandemiyi yaşatalım dediler.
Evet, biraz öyle oldu ama şu anda yapacak bir şeyimiz yok. O zaman hepinize iyi akşamlar.
Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere.